Welcome to a PSL demo day. I'm your host, Jason DeBacher. Today we have with us Aman Karmani. He's a CTO and co-founder of Fancy Bits. And he's here today to talk about an open source project he's worked on called taxsim.app. Aman, please.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. So yeah, my name is Aman Karmani. I am not really in academia. I don't have much experience with policy and all the stuff that you guys have been working on. I'm just sort of a developer. I'm an open source enthusiast. So I've been writing open source software for probably about 20 years now, just contributing to various projects. And I'm a taxpayer. And so that's sort of how I landed here. I pay my taxes every year, and recently I've tried to get involved in sort of open source code around tax filing. And one of the projects that I got involved with was also on GitHub. It's called US Taxes. It's sort of a web app where you can literally start to file your taxes right in the browser. You fill out a bunch of information, and at the end, it spits out a PDF that they kind of fill in with all that stuff. The cool thing about this is it runs entirely in your browser. It's all local. Your data's not going anywhere. And there's a nice community of developers that are sort of have been working on this. But as I got involved in some of this stuff, what I realized was I have no idea how the tax system really works. And I really wanted sort of a high level understanding of like, okay, what are the variables? How does tax outcome for people really, how is it impacted? What are the sort of inputs that have the most weight, for instance? Because even as I started working on this, there's so many schedules, there's so much breadth that I had no experience with. And to develop software that might be used by someone working on a farm or, in all of these different scenarios was very overwhelming. And I just wanted to take a step back. And so I started doing, just research. And I came across this paper by the NBER on automated tax filing, which is really interesting. Would it be possible for the government to send out sort of pre-filled tax returns to people? And what I realized in here is there's a large history of taxsim, which is what this paper also used to kind of simulate what would happen. And that's how I ended up learning about taxsim and getting exposed to taxsim at all. And so I sort of ended up here and started doing more research. And the first thing that's really interesting, this paper from 1993 even talks about like, the 17-year-old model. And so I realized that this thing has this huge history, and I'm sure you guys are much more familiar with this than I am, but it was kind of mind-blowing to me of like, wow, like all this work has been done for a long time. And so I started poking around in here and discovered Internet Taxsim, which, was my first kind of impression of this was like, oh, this is really useful, but I would build this completely differently. And my background in development is sort of full stack. So I've done anything from like running servers, kernel stuff. I ran a lot of the sort of Git infrastructure at GitHub for a long time, up to the front end. And I'm not really a designer, but I do enjoy kind of like poking at it. And certainly I enjoy kind of data presentation and layouts and graphs and that kind of stuff. And so I was like, oh, I could build something better than this that might be more approachable because this model is so powerful. It could be used by a layperson. It could be used by my parents to like try to figure out, okay, how much of their stock portfolio do they want to sell? What the impact of that would be on next year's tax returns. And so, yeah, even on here, when you calculate, you get, a lot of information out. There's obviously a lot of variables. And this really helped me kind of try to understand, okay, here are just 30 sort of inputs. And these are kind of really high level levers into the tax system and how much of an impact those things have. So as I started poking into this, I saw, okay, low level interface, that sounds interesting to me. And I discovered that, the inputs and outputs are this sort of CSV kind of format, very simple. And again, this kind of just made me realize that I could, probably integrate this and build something interesting out of it. But when I started getting into how do you actually run this thing, it was very interesting. It was like, okay, you can email these files, you can FTP them. There is this HTTP interface. But what I was really envisioning was something that was really responsive, right? So you should be able to like slide a slider and really see a real-time impact. And anytime you're hitting a server, there's going to be latency. The server is, at least a couple 100-second milliseconds away. And so you lose the kind of interface that I really had in mind. And so I wanted something more than that. So I looked at this other run on your local computer. That sounded more interesting. And they had an EXE, which I was able to run and execute locally. But again, what I was envisioning was I don't want all this data. I don't want the responsibility of someone entering their data and it even making it to my server. So having it run entirely in the browser was really sort of compelling. And so then the idea became, how do we kind of take the code, which isn't necessarily open, and maybe try to translate it. And so I reached out to the NBER. I talked to Dan. I kind of pitched him on what I was thinking, and he was kind enough to send me, this Fortran program, which is like, I think, a couple megs of just one single file of Fortran, which is really old school Fortran. So like the first character on every line has a special meaning. I honestly don't even understand most of it. I haven't really looked at the code that much, but my goal was to let me see if I can turn this into something that can run in the browser. And this is what I came up with, is a JavaScript version of taxsim that uses something called WASM, which stands for WebAssembly. And so the idea here is basically that you can take Fortran or C and convert it to something called WebAssembly, which is like assembly code, right? So assembly would be, if you have an Intel CPU, there's a certain instruction set of things you can do, and it depends per processor and architecture. But WebAssembly was, let's just standardize this and make something that is not processor dependent, but just sort of like these instructions that any browser or any runtime could translate into a native and run. So kind of almost like a Java model of like, an abstraction out. But again, here you can see that same kind of input, but this is all real time. It's like updating in milliseconds. It's at hundreds of milliseconds or seconds, right? And so even if you make an error in here, you get sort of the error code out, and you can start changing things. So you can see we're talking about 1970. If you change this to 2020, it just kind of updates in real time as you're getting the outputs out. And so this gave me enough of a base to start building a UI out. But I can talk about real quick how I ended up here. And so again, like the code that converts the Fortran into this JavaScript and WebAssembly is all open. It's in this repo taxsim.js. I don't bundle taxsim.app, so you kind of have to get a copy of that yourself. But Dan has kind of integrated this work back into their workflow. And so they're publishing now a WASM file that you can just download and use directly if you want. But I basically started Googling around, okay, like, what open source, what previous work has been done around converting Fortran into something that can run in the browser. And I ran into this great blog post and set of code. It's super complicated, but basically at the end of the day, there's a couple of projects out there. One is called mscripten, which converts any sort of C code into WebAssembly. And that's a really popular, let me pull that up, mscripten. It's been around for a long time, but it kind of pioneered a lot of this work that's been happening in the WebAssembly space of like, let's just take existing programs and convert them to something that can run in the browser. But the novel idea with this tool chain was basically, this guy figured out that you could take Fortran source, feed it into gfortran, sure, but then there's this plugin for gfortran called DragonEgg, which can take, instead of outputting like native binary, it can take the gfortran intermediate representation and convert it to an LLVM IR. So LLVM IR, the intermediate representation of that, can then be fed back into mscripten. And the whole idea here is mscripten can only take in C code, and we have Fortran code. So we can basically use this complicated thing on the left to convert it into something that can then feed back into mscripten. And then at the end of the day, you basically end up with the WASM and JavaScript. And so he put this up on his own GitHub. And so the nice thing here is it's kind of published as a Docker image. So all these pieces that are required to run this thing are packaged into a Docker image, which you can just use, and it has a compiler sort of built in that does all this for you. And so I was able to take this and kind of build it. That's essentially what my repo here is. It's a Docker file that pulls in this WASM compiler, copies in the taxsim source, and then runs the shell script that's bundled. And you can see there's a couple things in here, but we're basically telling mscripton to spit out a JS file at the end of the day. And that JS file gets uploaded. And so actually, this demo here actually lives on the taxsim servers. And you can literally click in here and like file save or right click save and download these files if you want to. And here's sort of the API. So on any web page, if you loaded that JavaScript file, then it exposes a JavaScript function taxsim that you can just execute and start getting these inputs and outputs. And so once I had this, then, I'll do a quick sidebar. So one of the cool things about this work was, initially there's all these other wrappers to taxsim. And one of them is in R, this project called US Income Taxes, where you can pull in this R package and kind of use it. So it just makes it much simpler for someone who's maybe doing some research and using R. But traditionally, the way that this worked, again, was it would upload through SSH or HTTP the data that you had up to a server, process it, download it. And it handled a lot of that for you. You didn't really even notice, but it might be kind of slow. And so the really cool thing is that this WASM file is now integrated into this R project. And so that all those R computations also happen locally, also happen super quick. And that's, again, because in R, there was a node or a V8 package that someone had already written that would pull in a JavaScript runtime that knows how to execute WASM. And so there was only maybe a couple hundred lines of code required to kind of bridge these two technologies together. And so the R code is now running a JavaScript runtime inside it that loads this WASM code and essentially executes, 50, 60-year-old Fortran, but in a modern environment. And so all this work sort of led to the taxsim.app, which is, just a simple domain I found. This is again, runs entirely in your browser. It does not communicate, does not log. There's no data, there's no cookies, there's nothing. And so the idea, again, is like anyone who wants to kind of get a sense of tax liabilities can go to this. So there's a couple cool features in here that I'll show off. But again, everything is sort of updates in real time, right? So as you're changing things around, 2021, the CARES credit goes down. If you're married, all of a sudden it goes up. If you have a couple of dependents, then you're getting a child tax credit. So again, like the idea was that you can just really start playing around in here and see what things have impact and what things don't. One of the cool things here is that as you're interacting with the page, all the variables sort of end up in the URL. And so it's really easy to share. So you could come up with a scenario and then send that to your accountant or send that to your family member or something like that. So down here is where you end up with all the inputs. And I kind of collapsed these away just to make it a little bit simpler because there's a lot. But I basically took each of those variables that we're all sort of familiar with. I'll pull those up over here in Internet taxsim. All of these variables like MSTAT and how much income and all that kind of stuff, and created these little boxes and kind of tried to link out and made them, again, also kind of real-time update, right? So as soon as you put in 41 grand over here, it kind of tells you that, there's a FICA tax of this amount that's being calculated, it's withheld. And I'm linking to, either the IRS or Wikipedia or different things in here to just kind of explain to the layperson what is going on with the tax system, what kind of forms that these things are reported on. And again, kind of bridging what I had learned myself on US taxes, coming from the filing perspective to kind of the policy perspective, and just trying to educate people and give them a tool and a resource.
Aman, can I ask you a question? This is
yes.
Rick Evans. So how is it so fast in my browser? Is the taxsim model somehow being, when I go to taxsim.app, is the taxsim tax logic and data somehow downloaded onto my machine?
Yes. So
what is the footprint of that for just a visit to this website? It's amazing how fast it is, and I'm not seeing a big footprint there.
Yeah, it's probably, a couple megabytes. Let me try to pull up over here. This is a new machine, so I'm not used to. It's gonna pull up the developer console that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on behind the scenes. Just give a second. Menu bar and advanced. All right, so if I right click on here and go to inspect, you can kind of look at the network bar, and I'll do a full refresh here. And so you'll see there's a JavaScript file that is kind of large, but this is all M scripted code. So I didn't write any of this. This is stuff that they maintain that kind of bridges like, hey, this program is trying to open a file in the file system. There's no file system in your browser, so it'll kind of bridge it and translate some of those system calls. And then there's this WASM file. So maybe if we click out of here, this one is about 300 kilobytes, it says. So, it's not a huge footprint, maybe a couple megs at most, but it's taking all that Fortran code, it compiled it to, instead of Intel CPU instructions, it's compiled to WebAssembly. And so the browser has all this code in here that knows to take, because at the end of the day, the Fortran code is mostly doing mathematics. And so in that sense, it was very straightforward. There's not a lot going on. It's not opening sockets to the internet. It's not creating files on disk. It's not mapping memory. It's just adding numbers together. And WebAssembly can do that and can represent that very simply of like, okay, take this register, load this number in, add this number to it, make these multiplications, all that stuff. And so literally that is what's going on. That, Fortran code that's been maintained by the NBER for the last 50, 60 years has been fully loaded into your browser, which could be on your computer or literally your mobile device. And you're executing that right there. And that's why you get that super fast feedback loop and everything is real time because it's happening on your device in your hand.
Yeah, I'm gonna try this on my mobile device while you're talking to see how well it works. It works great in my browser though. I love it.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, and I tried to make this, very mobile friendly. And so when you squeeze down, it kind of like uh, it's still visible and usable on a mobile device. Whereas if you expand it out, yeah. And so I'll show off some more features in here. Up top at the right are some hidden options. And so by default, these are all sliders, which can be useful if you're just trying to like get a sense of what happens. But if you're actually trying to, simulate a certain specific thing, then you can switch these over to text boxes. And so then it's much easier to type, 100,000 over here and expand this out. And maybe you have itemized deductions of 2,500 and you can kind of see what happens with that. And I tried to take a lot of the output variables and, again, make sort of a visualization that might be more approachable for the layperson, that they can sort of really understand, okay, here's your AGI and you're subtracting stuff, you end up with taxable income, then certain amounts of tax and credits are calculated on that, and you might have a net liability at the end of the day. Up here too is this developer mode. And so what that does is at the end of the page, it adds a visualization of the inputs and outputs that are going through the system. And so again, this is kind of what's being fed into the JavaScript function. And this matches, again, what you'll see, it's the same variables that are up here in the URL. You can switch these around. And so you can take that same CSV format if you wanted to copy it and feed it into taxsim yourself. Here, you again see the same CSV output that comes out raw from taxsim. And then I also have the text output that we saw on the other page, where again, on the other page, you're submitting something. When I click this, this is actually going to an NBER server, calculating on there and coming back. Whereas here, this is literally in your browser. You could turn off the internet and you could still keep using this. And that was another sort of consideration here. What I noticed on the documentation here was like, oh, if you're behind a firewall or you're sitting in a government secure facility and you're not allowed to contact my server, then maybe you can SSH it, all this kind of stuff. And with this, you don't even have to be on the internet, right? You can download literally like the JavaScript file and even this taxsim app and run it locally if you wanted to. So that's sort of that. I can point out a couple more things again, like in the spirit of open source, all of this stuff itself is also open source. And so this app is on my GitHub as well under taxsim.app. It uses a couple, newfangled kind of web technologies, Tailwind CSS, which I really enjoyed using, which is kind of like a CSS framework. You don't have to write a lot of CSS. You can do a lot of, you can sort of see it in real time as this person is adding just CSS markers into the HTML itself, that a lot of things start changing. And so that was really nice. Again, what I showed earlier of like adjusting to mobile devices, that was really easy. I use something called Vue.js, which is, if you've heard of React, it's very similar. It's, this reactive way of writing web apps where if you're making a change on what's part of the page, the other parts can kind of react in real time to it. And then I use this project called FormKit, which is actually powers a lot of what's going on. And it's just a way of creating forms, which you end up doing a lot, but it's schema driven. And so what you'll see if you wanted to dive into taxsim is that each of these kind of widgets on the site, so if we take this filing status, for instance, it's all generated through a schema where we're basically saying MStat is a radio button. It has, a couple options. I omitted implementing the married filing separately just because it'd be a lot more work. I did envision initially, right, if you were in filing separately, that each of these would have two things, because you would want to be able to specify separately primary versus spouse. And that just kind of like, I lost steam, and I was like, I realized also that it's not beneficial really ever to file separately. And so I omitted that option. But this is all schema driven in that even much of the reactivity is schema driven. And so like the number of dependents, depx, is numeric. And so, numeric ends up being something like this, which is something I customize of like, okay, it's something you can type into, but then you can also plus and minus. And it'll only show in these certain modes if MStat is either head of household, married, or separately. So if you go to single, you'll see it kind of disappears. And that's, again, just sort of managed by this FormKit thing. I ended up doing very little work for that. Then even the help text is kind of dynamic. And so you'll see that if the year is less than 2017, it'll say that it affects the personal exemption. And after that, the personal exemption went away. But then in 2018, the child tax credit came about. And so if we go to married over here, you'll see it says affects child tax credit. If I go down back to 2017, then all of a sudden changes to personal exemption. And so a lot of the logic is kind of embedded in just these structures and schemas. And so there's not a ton of code, but it's this project, again, you can run locally. And I notice I don't have a lot of instructions in here, so I'll try to flesh this out a little bit, but it's fairly easy to spin up, and you can make changes or mess with things. And yeah, I think that's all I really had. So I'm happy to open up to questions and dive into whatever else people are interested in hearing about.
Aman, that was great. I was really struck by kind of just the open sourceness of this, how you have, this was kind of a side project for you, and you were able to build upon all of these other projects to, without recreating a tax calculator, give users the ability to interact with the tax system. So it's a really cool story how this came about.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the power of open source, and that's how I've always approached it. I've given another version of this talk that's more on the open source side, developer focus, of like how even to break into open source. And that's really what it is. Like, I was interested in taxes, and like I, as a solo person, can't really wrap my head around this, but I can go to communities like US Taxes, go to the NBER, and like find communities of people that are working on similar things, and just use my resources to improve things, right? And so even with this Fortran toolkit, I spent a bunch of time in there of like working on things, because I realized that, hey, I'm using this thing, I can make this better for the next person that wants to use it. They were still on MScript in 2 or 1, and I realized that I could upgrade it. That might make things faster for me as well. and I was able to collaborate with this person, go back and forth with them, figure out a bunch of stuff, like, you know, a lot of work. But then again, like the next person that wants to do this in the same way that I really benefited from someone have already done this work can benefit, and maybe the next Fortran project from the 50s or 60s can also become a web app, right? It's just like that's the sort of community and giving back aspect that I really enjoy of working open source, and this was just another way of doing that. And then at the end of the day, I was able to create something that, you know, I had been able to send to my accountant, I had been able to send to my brother, and like just make useful to the whole world, all this work that has been happening behind the scenes.
Have you circled back to U.S. taxes, and has what you learned here been helpful at all to your U.S. taxes contributions?
A little bit, yeah. So I haven't had much time to spend on U.S. taxes after this, but you know, I kind of understand much better at a high level now what the tax system feels like, and one of my goals is to take a lot of these links and this information, educational information, to put it back into the U.S. taxes website of like, okay, here you're entering maybe your 1099 div, but what really is that? How does that impact your taxes? What part of the tax system are you interfacing with? With U.S. taxes in particular, one of the challenges that we have is that it basically can only fill out a paper PDF, and then you mail in that paper PDF. And you know, there was a crazy story recently of just photos of the cafeteria of the IRS is filled with paper because they're so backlogged. And so I started exploring, is there a way to maybe e-file from U.S. taxes, or what is really possible there? And there's not a ton right now because, you know, I started getting into the e-filing system. It's very complicated. There's a lot of bureaucracy to even get to that point. But maybe there are some sort of workarounds in that there's this other site called freefillableforms.com or something like that, that's maintained by, I think, Intuit, but it's funded by taxpayer dollars, and it's sort of the only way that you can fill out forms yourself. And so I started exploring maybe there's a way to export instead of to PDF. We can export the data into a JavaScript format that can then maybe feed into a Chrome extension that can automatically fill out the forms on the website for you, and then that way you can e-file. But really, I'm hoping, you know, like there has been some funding for the IRS recently. They're doing a study now on how can we improve and automate and upgrade our systems, and so hopefully we get to that point. Yeah, that is sort of my next step with this is, you know, again, like it's hard as a solo developer or even a small open source team to just face the breadth of the filing system and all the needs that different filers have. But I'm hoping, you know, long term that I can move away from paid software myself. That was my goal initially, of like, I would like to be able to file my own taxes with open source software. And I don't think I'm at that point yet, but, you know, year over year, that's what I'm planning to put my resources towards.
Aman, what's the status of just the funding of this work? So there are some nice things that saved you some time, but it's a lot of work. And are you collaborating directly with NBER? Is NBER investing in this? NBER has this just historical database of tax logic and this way to interface with it. Are they investing in you building this out for them and maintaining this, or does that funding need to come from somewhere else?
There's not really any funding behind this. You know, again, this is like just a passion project that I have that I'm giving back to the community. There's not the way that this is hosted. Again, it's just like static files. You know, there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of cost to it, and so I purchased this domain for 10 years. Like, you know, this static content is going to be hosted and available forever if I can help it. But again, like all this stuff is open source too, and so if this site goes down, anyone can spin it up. And we have been collaborating with, you know, a couple people. The person who did the work on the R project and I have been collaborating with Dan to just sort of like update some of their systems. We have a lot of this code replicated on their systems, and they have sort of committed to anytime that they update their Fortran code, in addition to exporting and making available their EXEs and the artifacts that they already had in the past, they're now going to publish a new version of this WASM as well. And so in that sense, the work has been integrated back into what they're doing. And so going forward, that WASM code is going to be updated and is going to be available if someone wants to integrate it into other places.
Hey, Aman, this is really impressive, I have to say.
Thank you.
But I'm looking at in the developer mode under the output,
Mm-hmm.
and the first like 9 or so variables have names, and then there's V10 through V45.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what that's supposed to be representing?
Yeah, that's literally the raw output that kind of comes out. It's unfortunate that it's not really labeled well, and perhaps in the JSON format I can translate some of those. But even in here, if you let's see, it is documented somewhere in here.
Okay.
Yeah, here you go. So here the first 9 columns are named, and then afterwards they're kind of just numbered. I don't know why they ended up doing it that way. Just maybe it was easier in the Fortran code. But certainly, I think you're right. Like a lot of the UI underneath the hood is taking these variables and knowing to put them in the right place and label them and all that kind of stuff. But we could do that over here too. And I did notice that even in the R version, they do a better job of translating those over because those numbers are not really that interesting. Yeah, description of output columns, and I think this is what they ended up doing, and maybe I could just copy this. This would make the most sense. So then you get both the number and kind of like a descriptive variable of what it actually is.
Just a quick, the married filing separate, I guess divorce attorneys are most, and it's like a divorce, I think primarily.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and on that too, I mean, you might not have to double the inputs, right? Because each person would be filing singly, so they could just, do it twice. Have 2 different browser windows open here and do for each of them.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so it might be worth just exposing it and letting them do it that way. That's a good point. Yeah.
I don't know. This is super interesting, and it's really so a project I've worked on, Tax Calculator, which is cataloged in the PSL library. We do some validation against taxsim, and they've come along with the ways to interact with that application. You pointed out with F2P, and it's relatively new to be able to interact with the model that way. But you provide an even better platform, and it seems like the WASM. I haven't seen this R project before, but it seems like potentially there's a way to do this on a larger scale where you have data from many different filers represented and can just kind of loop through them in the calculator within your browser. And the speed of the calculation is so fast, it seems like that wouldn't take too long to do.
Yeah, certainly. Like this UI is, much more geared towards a single tax filer trying to understand. And so there's certainly another UI that would be much more focused towards the academia use case where you could bulk, process stuff. And again, it's super fast, because those math operations on a modern CPU take no time at all. And so you could shove in like hundreds of thousands or even millions of rows and do it. And yeah, like I think there's already some work happening to try to explore how to integrate this into the Stata plugin that exists for taxsim. But the WASM stuff, it's still pretty early, but things have gotten mature enough that every single browser now has WASM built in, and then there are a bunch of runtimes, and so WASC is this kind of this interface that's being developed, and in the final stage, it's being actually standardized. But the idea basically is like you have instructions which are make sense when you're doing mathematical stuff, but then anytime you're interacting with your system or operating system, then there's a layer of system calls that have to be implemented. And that's where things like opening files, talking to networks, dealing with things that are not just CPU instructions, but interacting with the operating system. That's where this stuff gets muddy and it's being finalized and improved a lot. And so nowadays, there's WASM sort of execution libraries and runtimes that are popping up in every single different language. And so in a couple of years, it's going to be that much easier and more integrated, where any sort of runtime or environment that you're in, you're going to be able to load in WASM. And that's kind of the direction that things are moving in, that it doesn't matter if I write a bunch of code in Rust or Go or any language, that I can translate to WASM, and then that can be loaded into another program that might be written in a different language. And we're finding that this is probably the best way to interop all these different ways of, like, again, taking Fortran and the browser, two totally different things, and finding a way to bridge them.
Yeah, this is so cool. Aman, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a great presentation, and I'm excited to learn more about the model myself.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. Again, my GitHub is, I'm TMM1 on GitHub. If you want to email me about any of the stuff, Aman at tmm1.net. And all the stuff is open source, so feel free to poke around. Even if you want to create issues, you know, someone created an issue the other day of, like, there's a typo here. All that stuff is super easy to fix, and you can even jump into that schema and make a lot of the changes yourself if you want to send me a PR. But I'm happy to hear feedback, and I'm happy to, you know, make simple changes like that, like changing those numeric outputs to be more readable, things that would make this a more useful tool to anybody that wants to use it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aman.
Awesome.